Perfect. All right, let's get started. Hello, my name is Umbreen Ali. I'm the founding editor of Central Daisy, and today we are tackling a challenging and pervasive problem in New Jersey, the segregation of our schools. What do you mean by segregation? Many of you might be asking. Well, 4 years ago, 9 students, their families, and a coalition of civil rights and religious groups filed a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey for having segregated schools that are leaving Black and Latino students racially isolated and surrounded by poverty. In fact, New Jersey has the 6th most segregated schools nationally in terms of the exposure that Black students have to white students, and 7th for Latino students and their exposure to white students, according to that 2019 report by the Civil Rights Project and the Center for Education and Civil Rights. As we await a ruling from the New Jersey Superior Court on that lawsuit, which could lead to fundamental changes in how New Jersey operates its school systems and launch kind of a wide-scale desegregation effort like the kinds we haven't seen in decades, I want to turn our focus today to the experience of the students, the teachers, the parents who experience this segregation. While segregation is often seen as a black and white issue, the experience of it affects all of New Jersey's student population, including Asian Americans. And in fact, there are 68 schools in the state that are majority Asian American and 16 that are more than 75% Asian. They're concentrated primarily in Mercer and Middlesex counties and that central belt of the state where many Asian Americans reside, but there's also some in North Jersey. In West Windsor, the West Windsor Plainsboro Regional School District is 72% Asian, making it the highest Asian population district in the state. And John Adams Middle School is 87% Asian. And we're going to focus a little bit on John Adams today because we have a teacher who has taught there. And we also have with us a former student of Ridgewood High School, and we have a parent and activist with us who is a psychiatrist. So let me introduce the panel and then we'll get started. So Dr. Kani Ilangovan is a mother, activist, and child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist. She is also an activist who has helped have Asian American history curriculum mandated in the state and can talk a little bit about that effort. Michael Trumbauer is a 9th grade English teacher from Plainfield High School who also taught at John Adams last year. And then Christina Huang is a Ridgewood High School graduate who has written about segregation in New Jersey schools and is now at UNC Chapel Hill. So welcome to all of you. And Christina, I really think it's important for us to ground this conversation in the perspective that students have. So I'd love to start with you. If you could just talk a little bit about what it was like to go to Ridgewood and your school experience before that, how it sort of compared to that experience, and then what motivated you to start to write about the issue of segregation, organize around it.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this panel. I think talking about desegregation in classrooms is so important. As a student that just finished the K through 12 system, so the first half of my K through 12, I went to a rather like low performing school. I think as of like 2020 to 2021 school year, it was one of the placed bottom 50% of schools in New Jersey. In regards of this test scores and like its math proficiency and reading proficiency. And then I transitioned to Ridgewood High School, which is a little more rigorous and has more resources and funding. So I got to see the differences in the resources allocated to each schools. And both schools were predominantly white. One school was in rural area and the other one was in the suburbs. And I could tell like there was definitely like a difference of like code switching where when I was at home, especially being in an Asian family, the way I interact with my parents and my siblings, whereas at school, I had to be more like aware of like the way I spoke and how I, realizing how that would changed in how I'd be treated. Um, And I also could tell that like in my experiences, I was always very fearful of like being judged. So it always resulted in me not speaking up that much. Um, and when I did after I started the activism with Asian American like history in classrooms, I started a student group for students of color to create like a safe space for students because there was very few of us. And I remember the first time told my classmates about this in my AP Gov class, and I remember like a lot of people started like chuckling and laughing as if it was like, oh, here they go again, another safe space. And I had teachers make fun of like safe spaces before, and so I was very uncomfortable, but like having that space was so important to me because our first meeting we talked about first day in schools, and someone had talked about how on the first day of school a lot of our students thought it was really funny to call them a chink. And that triggered a whole conversation of another student. She talked about one of her first days walking the classroom where she had a classmate ask her if they could use the N-word and if they could have an N-word card or whatever that means. And so I think there's a disconnect with students of color realizing what resources we want and we need, and between like the teachers and students kind of realizing what it is like to be a student of color at a predominantly white institutions.
Wow, that's so powerful just hearing that perspective and how that space allowed some of these students to share the experiences they've and just as you were sharing the experiences, I just thought, this is a very segregated, or sorry, very diverse state. And so to think that there are students that have, you know, ideas like they can use racial slurs in the state of New Jersey just makes me worry about the state of the nation a little bit. You would hope that a state like ours wouldn't have that problem. So do you think that creating that space was empowering, or do you think that there was sort of a shared experience among those who kind of gathered there? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a very empowering, but it was a lot of work for like I think myself as someone who's never really led anything like that before. Um, and I think there's a lot of responsibility put onto the student activists, right? Because there's not a lot of representation in the classroom. So on top of going through this, racialized climate and then lack of representation with your teachers and trying to figure also focusing on your education, it was a lot to handle. And I think if there was the proper support from like the administration, I think it would have been a lot more successful and a lot more empowering. But given the limited like resources and things like that, I think it was very difficult to handle. I think a lot of students appreciated and wanted that space to have just to talk it out, just have a conversation. And I definitely think a lot of these issues would not happen if there were more representation within like the student body. And it wasn't that there were a few of us clinging to each other, being like, this is happening. They're putting up White Lives Matter stickers around the school. They're drawing swastikas in the bathroom. And and I've talked to admin before, like administrators before, and their whole response was, it's just teenagers being teenagers. There's nothing much we can do. And so that was also very disheartening to hear.
Michael, I want to ask you, just hearing what Christina's sharing here, if you could tell us a little bit about your perspective, both at John Adams and then where you teach now. Are you surprised by anything she's saying? Does it reflect kind of what you have experienced at these schools? And you can talk a little bit about the demographics of your schools because it's quite different than Ridgewood.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously teaching at John Adams last year and Plainfield this year, they're two very, very different student demographics. Most of the schools I've worked in across my career have mostly been they've predominantly had a student body, mostly made of students of color. But even within those student bodies, sometimes they can still use discriminatory language towards one another. One thing I've noticed with my students this year, because pretty much all my students are students of color, they will often use slurs or racially targeted language as jokes to one another. And it's a very awkward place to be in as a teacher, especially one that is white, because, on one hand, I have the Hispanic students messing with the black students and the black students messing back, and they genuinely think that this is very, very funny. But I know that like if they were to use this language anywhere else, it means something completely different because it's a completely different culture outside of their little bubble. And I think that goes back to the whole conversation about how much the state of New Jersey is segregated in terms of schooling, is because a lot of them don't have exposure to people outside of their own culture. Um, Even with me being part of the LGBT community, a lot of them will ask me very innocently targeted questions, but maybe come off a little bit not as respectful as they want to in terms of how they're wording their questions. And also, I've unfortunately had similar things with like swastikas being drawn on my board, or finding them around the school. And so I'm not surprised at some things, but it's definitely interesting because the way that they even talk about white people is funny. They have this very interesting perception that, oh, if you're white, you're automatically rich, because their only exposure is through media, through TV shows, through whatever they're consuming on TikTok. And they only have their own experiences to reflect upon that compared to the experiences they're seeing online. And obviously online, you're going to post the best of the best. You're not going to post anything that would make people think of you a certain way, in a negative light. So it's very interesting to see that kind of demographic there, because they're on one hand they're very aware of how the world works, unfortunately at such a young age, but on the other hand, if they go down the street, um, for context, my old middle school is 13 minutes away from my current high school, and even with that short drive, student bodies are completely different. If they go down the street, the culture entirely changes, the demographic entirely changes, even within like what they can say, how they're going to be acting, and all of that. So it's fascinating. It's just fascinating how we've gotten to this place.
Yeah, and I'm curious as you're sharing some of what you've just observed, whether you feel like those are conversations you can bring into the classroom. Do you ever talk about race in the context of your curriculum, or is it something that at the school level gets addressed, especially when there are maybe instances like you mentioned of people drawing swastikas?
So it really depends on the incident. The way that I structure my lessons is I try to base it on a lot of real world application, because that's always like the number one thing that everyone in high school says is, oh, when am I going to use this outside of high school? So I really try to give them that reason of, oh, you're going to use this, in this hypothetical situation or something along those lines. It's a little bit easier since I teach English, and through literature, we're able to read a lot about their own personal experiences. So my own classroom library, I have a lot of books that I've hands selected for them to be able to read, because we do independent reading every single day. So they're supposed to be reading, and that way they kind of get a little bit more of that exposure. But in terms of a lot of those racial conversations, I usually don't have any kind of way to do like a lesson specifically on this, especially because I teach freshmen, so they're a little bit younger, a little bit more immature. I usually do it in terms of teachable moments. So when something happens, I will call it out and be like, hey, that's not okay. And a lot of the time that will strike up a conversation. A big one that I'm still working on is a lot of them don't realize that the R word is a slur. Um, so, and that's very much embedded into their vocabulary, because they just kind of use it in the sense of, oh, this is the same as saying dumb. And I have to keep explaining, like, well, that's the problem, because those people aren't dumb, but do you see how you're insinuating that by using that language in that context? And then they just kind of sit there and think about it like, oh, I didn't mean that. I'm so sorry. So it's very much just about not understanding, not having exposure, and that's what it really comes down to in terms of most of the mistakes that they make.
Yeah, it just comes down to segregation, is really what you're saying. The fact that our towns and our schools are segregated, and so that natural diversity that would kind of help people understand each other's cultures better, and like not run into this situation where they are unaware of other ways of being what exists. So Kani, I kind of want to get that perspective from you, because I know, and maybe we can start by, you can just talk about your own kind of trajectory, as a parent who's become an activist and is working on these issues, but then also just give us a sense of what this looks like kind of statewide, since your activism has helped you engage with many school districts, you have kind of a good lay of the land.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a product of segregated schools. I was one of the few brown kids in my nearly all-white school, and I'm very grateful my parents decided to put me in a diverse school in 7th grade. And since then, whenever possible, I chose diverse educational environments for myself and for my kids. I noticed a huge difference in my self-esteem and sense of identity when I was in a diverse school environment versus a segregated one. And the school district, I'm from West Windsor's Plainsboro School District, which is the 72% Asian school district. And, we moved to this area in 2000. And since then, there's been white flight from our town. When I first moved here, it was closer to, 60% white. But now it's, like less than 30%. And we have records going back for decades. And you can see as more and more Asian Americans move into the area, more and more white people moved away. And one of my friends is a guidance counselor who worked at this district. And she would tell this story about two little girls who were playing together. And one of the little girls said to the guidance counselor, "My dad said we're moving away because there are too many Indian people here. Let's go and play, Priya." So the little girl, in her innocence, admits to her father's racist reasons for moving away, and then goes off to play with the girl with an Indian name. And my daughter was telling me in her 7th grade history class, they were learning about how when this country was formed, only white men could be landowners. And then the students looked around their classroom and they said, "There's no one in this class who could be a landowner," because their teacher was a white woman and all the kids were Indian, and so this problem with segregation, I feel like it really benefited me to get to go to a different school and be with Latinx kids, Black kids, white kids, Middle East kids, Asian American kids. I'm so grateful I had that. And, I feel sorry for my kids, actually. I tried to give them a diverse environment, but it got more and more segregated as we lived here. And, I feel sad. Like you said, this is a very diverse state. And why should they have this very segregated experience? There's something wrong in the design of our schools that this is happening, at the design of our school districts that this is happening. And as you said, I've been doing advocacy for AAPI curriculum in schools. And, very grateful to Governor Murphy for signing those bills into law. And with the advocacy we're doing, we've been meeting with different school districts, and there's over 600 school districts in New Jersey, which is a ridiculous number of school districts. And each district is like its own kingdom, and they get to decide the curriculum. And, so we've met with 30 plus districts, and some of them have been diverse, some of them have not been diverse. We went to the Cumberland County's curriculum consortium, which is mostly white schools. And, it was kind of hard to give a presentation there, actually, because I didn't feel that they were all that interested, sorry to say, but some other districts were much more interested and much more welcoming, and it's unfortunate because like some of those districts where there's only very few AAPI kids, those are probably the districts that need it the most, because, I grew up in such a district and it really would have changed my life. And Christina grew up in such a district and it would have changed our life to be able to see someone who looks like us in the curriculum, and know that our people who look like us help build this country. So I'm talking about two different things here now about segregation and representation in schools. But, I'm really glad you're bringing this to light. I think it's so important to address this. And I think that if our schools are less segregated, then we help provide, help our children learn how to live in diverse societies.
Right, and I do think those two issues are connected because when the school population around you is diverse, it invites natural curiosity about the differences among, one another. And when it's not, it gives the false impression that the world looks like the segregated experience you're having, especially as Christina, you were saying about your high school, like a place that's majority white. It's easy for students there to feel like most of America looks like that. I mean, certainly, media representation and other places reinforce that idea. So the need to have diverse curriculum starts to feel less urgent, or the need to have safe spaces, as you said, because the feeling is that, well, who needs those? we're the majority, right? And so I think they can go hand in hand. And I do want to get your perspective. You mentioned that example of the white flight, and I wonder, do you feel like what is the root cause here? Is it about where people live, because schools are based on location and where people are geographically placed, and is that the root cause of why our schools are segregated, or is it something else? Is it about the schools themselves, and how closely are those two issues connected? Because part of this conversation, as we think about what's the solution, is that really how our schools should be? Should they be based on where people are geographically located if our geographies are deeply segregated?
I'm so sorry. Who's that question directed to?
To you, yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I was proud of Senator Gopal. He had put forward legislation to reduce the number of school districts to 100 from 600. But unfortunately, I don't think he got much support for that bill. But I do think that's part of the problem. We have way too many school districts, and they are, often by racial lines. So I think that's part of the problem. There's a wonderful report that came out by the Education Law Center, and they had a lot of different solutions. One of them was reducing the number of districts. Another one was allowing district transfers, allowing students to, go and attend school at a different district. And that happens in Boston. Another solution was creating magnet schools that children from multiple districts could come to. And that was a solution I experienced when I was in high school. I went to a magnet school, and then I had a very diverse experience there because they purposely cultivated diversity in their student body. And, I think, that would be a great solution in New Jersey, to have more diverse magnet schools, that people who value diversity could come there if they want. It would be a good starting point anyway. And, one other solution was to stop secession, which is allowing districts to basically secede and have a more homogeneous student body. So I agree with all of those proposed solutions. So I'm sorry, what was the rest of your question?
It was about how the geography impacts these school populations, and whether, I think some of that you answered in your answer, is it embedded in the solution kind of separating the geography from the ways that we zone schools. And I know that there are school districts in New Jersey that are trying to deal with that, sort of within their townships, just sort of having busing to address any sort of disparities among the schools. But to what extent is this about where people choose to live, as you mentioned with the white flight example in your area?
Yeah, no, I liked what Michael had shared, that within just a 10-minute drive, there was dramatically different student populations, and it would be great if they could draw the district in such a way that those populations could be together. But yeah, white flight is a real thing, unfortunately. And, there's a certain number, I think it's 30%, at which, after 30%, then white people start to move out of the neighborhood because they are not the majority anymore, or they're still the majority, but they feel like less of the majority. And one of my friends was telling me how her neighbor was joking with her, "Oh, we're selling our house, and guess who's buying it?" And of course, it was an Indian person, and she felt kind of awkward and didn't know what to say. But it's just a reality in our town. It's changed a lot.
So interesting. And I feel like it's sort of another topic, why people choose to live where they do. And I think that there's a lot to explore there in terms of why, the outside perception of why Asian Americans choose to live near one another versus the reality, in the sense of where people might feel safe living, where people might feel supported living, where people might, be in community living. And so I feel like that's another topic to explore. Michael, I want to ask you, based on kind of your experience in the two schools that we talked about, and demographic-wise, tell us a little bit about Plainfield, and sort of, you said it was majority Black and Latino, right?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact breakdown, but it's probably about 85% Hispanic or Black. And obviously there's going to be a lot of overlap in those statistics as well, with students being part of both of those groups. And we do have very few students of other races, but for the most part, it's mostly that demographic. Whereas with Edison, it was about the same percentage, if not a little bit more, Indian. And I remember that I think it was one white student and 3 or 4 Black students, and the rest of my students were Indian. And even within those classes, even within the schools themselves, students can also be segregated. All of my Black students were in the one academic level that I was teaching. My other 3 honors were all Indian, and my one white student. And those Black students were also the ones that were often getting into trouble the most. They were also the ones that were always kind of having to be watched to make sure that, like, oh, these students are the ones that are usually, like, quote unquote the troublemakers. And there were times where sometimes they were actively causing some trouble, but I think a lot of the time it's just because they were having such a watchful eye on them. They were just catching more that other students were also doing, but just because they were flying under the radar, they weren't necessarily getting in trouble as much. And that was always something that never felt quite right with me. Especially because with Plainfield, there are a lot of people that recognize the situation. They recognize that Plainfield High School is the high school that they want their kids to go to. So they unfortunately look to charter schools, or they either try to go to other districts. I've heard of Plainfield students going to South Plainfield, North Plainfield. Some students will even go to Edison as well, and that's like a whole other conversation because it's such a culture shock to them in terms of academics and also just social. They go to Bound Brook, they go to Piscataway nearby. There's a lot of ways that they try to get their students or their children into the other nearby schools. And that in itself is a good thing and a bad thing, because I've also heard a lot of them coming back to Plainfield because they're saying, oh, my child was treated so differently at those other schools that, like, I just didn't feel comfortable with them continuing to remain there. And that's, again, is unfortunate because at least the way that my school last year in Edison was set up, even though the student population was predominantly Indian, the teaching staff was predominantly white. And I unfortunately had so many students come up to me and say, you're the only teacher that pronounces my name correctly. Because I know that's such a big thing, is making sure that you're getting students' names correctly. I know for students that have those hard to pronounce names, when there's a sub or the first day of school, it's always such a big source of anxiety that I always try to make it so clear, like, listen, I'm not perfect. I might mess it up for the first couple of days, but please keep correcting me. I will make a note of it. I will write it down, but getting your name correct is so important because that's who you are. Your name is part of your identity. It's part of your culture. I want to make sure that that's celebrated because it's not right for me to deny you of that. And so many of them would tell me, like, oh, my teachers, it's, like March, April, May, and my teacher's still calling me the wrong name. And that's unfortunately something I've heard even when I was going through my graduate program. When I was student teaching in New Brunswick, when I was, doing subbing with other districts in the state, it's just very subtle things that some teachers don't take that seriously that could really make such a big deal in students' academic careers.
Yeah. And you touched on several things there that I think are so interesting. One, you mentioned the Black students getting into more trouble at John Adams, where they are 5% Black is the population at John Adams. And, those students may have experienced a lifelong set of discrimination against them for being Black and kind of being targeted as the troublemakers even from a very young age. And so you can kind of see how those problems continue, like sort of start to mount as the years go on. And your point about teachers is a really important one. We have a kind of a pipeline shortage in New Jersey, but especially so for people of color teachers. The vast majority of teachers in the state are white, and a lot of them don't receive the cultural training they need to be in some of these schools, and Kani, that's something I'm sure with the Asian American history curriculum, something that you probably have come across. Christina, I want to ask you, based on kind of what you're hearing in the conversation and just your own experience, like, What do you think are some of the problems that segregation creates for students who go through New Jersey schools?
Yeah, I think Michael put it really well that with segregated schools, within segregated schools, students are segregating themselves. So, and so most of my friends in high school, because I didn't have the best experiences trying to integrate myself into like with my other white students, um, I tended to group with Asian students because I felt more comfortable. They understand me. They wouldn't mock me for like my parents' accent or kind of feel like an outcast within the groups. So you kind of cling on to these groups. And so you see, even in the lunchroom, like the Asian kids are together, the Black kids together, the Hispanic kids are together, and the white kids are together. And so I think it starts to create a problem because even if you start to have a little more diversity, if those students aren't like hanging out together and trying to get to know each other, then you're losing that like the positives of a diverse classroom. And I think both Connie and Michael touched on this, but teacher representation is so important. I think in my entire K through 12 of all like the dozens of teachers I had, I probably had 3 Asian American teachers. I think I had like 1 Black teacher, and I don't think I've ever had a Hispanic or Indigenous teacher. And so, and of the Asian American teachers I've had, I've gotten so close to them because like I felt so heard and seen, and they understand my struggles. And if it wasn't for my Asian American teacher in high school, I don't think I'd be in activism. I think she definitely helped with my self-esteem and being like, it's okay, like you should talk. Um, it's like okay to like just talk what's in your mind. It's good for you, and like introducing me to like activism work. So I think having that representation and in like within teachers is so important. And I think having that sort of also accountability for whether it's teachers or students. I've shared this story with Connie before, but I was very shocked recently to find out that and this is something that's been happening not just in New Jersey schools, but across the country. So there was a student who had been he with his white friends in I think during lunchtime, he was sold off kind of like in a slave auction. And he was one of the only Black students there. And it was very disheartening to hear, and I felt so incredibly like terrible for him. And I was like, that is so awful. And I think I understood his mentality a little bit. It's like, since you are young, you're kind of told, okay, don't make a big deal. You kind of have to like, you just accept what people students throw at you. A lot of times it's misguided, it's misunderstood, and it was also really wrong. But even if they stretch your eyes at you, they call you names, you kind of just move on. And that's how I was taught. You laugh it off, because if you internalize it too much, it's too painful. So yeah, and I think that was like, although I'm not the same race, it hit close to home to hear that, wow, that's like something that's been happening. And it's a result of things like our segregated school systems. Because our parents work so hard to put us into these amazing school systems. But, the students that are there, they face a lot of racism. And the students that aren't in these school systems, they know that they aren't in best performing schools, that they don't have the resources. Like, kids aren't dumb. Like, they know from a young age that this is a good school, this is where I want to go, and this is a bad school, or whatever, a bad school or low performing school. And so you kind of like internalize that to yourself and your performance in schools and your self-esteem. And I think seeing such diversity or such drastic differences in school districts that are like 15 and 20 minutes away is kind of crazy, because it's like they're purposely trying to keep out certain students from school systems. And I've, of the few Black students that are at Ridgewood High School, I know I've spoken to some of them, and it's really difficult to hear some of the stories that they have been through. And I think if we were to integrate schools, I think it would have amazing outcomes on students. And it's not just students of color that would benefit. I think a lot of the white students would also really benefit from like the diversity and learning about different cultures. And it just, I think being now in college where I remember stepping on campus and I was like, wow, like UNC Chapel Hill's not as diverse as it should be, but it's a lot more diverse than I was used to. And there's no way to measure like college culture. It's just you step on campus and like you have people setting up tables and like they're telling you about your culture, and they have like these magazines about like different identities, and you're like, this is so incredible. Like they're playing like cultural music, and like you're walking down campus, and it's such an amazing feeling to feel like I belong here. Like there's people who understand me, there's people who don't understand my culture, but I feel so like I can tell them about my background. So I think if I were to like, that's something I tell a lot of my friends who are going to college now, like that it's so exciting to go to a school that has a lot of diversity, because you learn so much from in the classroom, but outside the classroom, it's so rich, and you are going to learn a lot, and you're going to enjoy the people you're going to meet. And I'm like, it's really sad that you don't get that experience until you leave some of the K through 12 systems. But I think if it rules in the favor of like integrating schools, I think it would have amazing outcomes on students.
I wonder if you can share a little bit more about how becoming an activist around this kind of made you feel. Did that help you deal with some of the challenges or even kind of the racism that you experienced? Did it make you feel like there's something that can be done? Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of how that made you feel, or the outcome of that?
Yeah, I think being in activism is really empowering. I think most of it, of like my K through 12 and childhood, it was okay, like, this person doesn't like me, there's like racial tensions, and you just kind of push it away. But with activism, I think I am so grateful to be brought in this sphere, thanks to Kani and a lot of other activists who have inspired me. Like, I have a voice, and it matters that you can, even though like I was like a child, like 17 years old when I got started, like I still can create an impact, and you can create change that like, here's something that I might have missed out on, and people like in my generation might move on, but like the next wave of students, they can benefit from this, because I benefited from a lot of things that past activists have done. And so creating that new environment for students to thrive. And I had a mom tell me that one of her kids came home talking about Patsy Mink, who she was like one of the first Asian American women in Congress, had to do a lot with Title IX. And she's like learning all about her, and it was so exciting to like, they saw themselves in the pamphlet, and like I never learned about Patsy Mink, and it was also like an educational moment for me. And so I think it's incredible to hear that like this is someone that I didn't learn about till I was an adult, but now kids way younger than us are learning about them, and it's really inspiring. And I think it's like little things like this that like keeps like moving the pin forward, and it makes me excited to see like what other people are doing and what's in the future.
Michael and Kani, I'd love to have you kind of chime in as well, in what you see as kind of some of the potential solutions to the problems that we're talking about, both the structural ones and kind of the cultural ones that students are experiencing in our schools. Kani, maybe you can start, and then we'll go to Michael.
Well, I'm very proud of Christina and her activism, and I would like all kids to feel empowered like Christina. And I do think affinity spaces are important, and I hope all schools can offer affinity spaces to their students. So even if there aren't very many of them, they can get some, community support. I do think we have to work on school desegregation. It's really shameful that we're such a diverse state and our schools are so segregated. So I hope that the Supreme Court decision will go well, and I hope that our state legislature will make some changes in how districts are structured and allow district transfers and create magnet schools, like basically to follow the recommendations of the Education Law Center. And I'm grateful also to the Rutgers Policy Lab, because they really have analyzed how it makes a huge difference in outcomes, both in math and science, and also in terms of disciplinary statistics. They've seen that schools that are more segregated, the kids experience more suspensions and more detentions, and also they show how they get fewer guidance counselors. It's a huge difference in how the guidance counselor to student ratio. it's really wrong what's being done to these kids. And I hope that our state can correct course. In terms of cultural, I would like to see all kids reflected in their curriculum, not just AAPI kids, all kids to be able to see how their community helped build America and why America's better for all of us. And it's, I don't only want, like, for example, with AAPI kids, I want AAPI kids to know our history, but I also want their other classmates to know it too, because, we're seen as forever foreigners. And people don't know about Patsy Mink. They don't know about Wong Kim Ark, who fought for birthright citizenship. And because of him, anyone who's born here can be a citizen. They don't know these stories. And then we won't have to be seen as forever foreigners if they know, we all created this country together. And I feel the same way, for all other communities too. If we can see, like, as America, what makes us really strong is how diverse we are, and we need to value and celebrate that diversity, and share the stories, not just give a monoculture story. We should tell the full, rich history of our country that makes us great.
And if I can add to that, just it feels to me in this current moment that maybe the lesson is that the efforts to desegregate, after the civil rights movement, I think there are plenty of people who kind of feel like it was a one and done situation. We desegregated and we are now desegregated, but this is actually a journey. And America is increasingly becoming diverse. And I think that as we kind of see that continue, there's a continuing need to reevaluate, because you're right, we do have a very diverse country, but it's evident that our school system in this very diverse state is failing to give that diverse experience to our students. And so, it's not a marker of failure necessarily, but it is a marker that more work needs to be done, that it's time to reevaluate and reassess and see what's working and what's not working. And that's probably work that will never finish. And I think just having that approach to it makes it feel less politicized, less divisive. It's just a journey that America is on, and America needs to continue on that journey. And embrace kind of what it is as a country that has benefited from all the diversity that's come through. So those are just my 2 cents on it. But Michael, I'd love to kind of hear from you as well on that, and any potential solutions that you see.
For starters, I absolutely love the magnet school idea. I have a couple of my freshmen applying to go to the Union Votech program, and those magnet schools are not pushed as much as they should be. A lot of teachers are still in the mindset of you need to go to college. College is the only way that you are going to be able to have a career after high school. So a lot of those technical careers kind of get pushed to the side when a lot of students are actually very genuinely interested or might already be working in those fields. And because that's a magnet school, anyone in that particular district is able to apply. And I know even last year, even though I was teaching 8th grade, I felt like in a way I was teaching 12th grade, because so many of my 8th graders were applying to these various different high schools that were specifically for health and sciences or something, that they were specifically interested in maybe pursuing in college. And the District of Edison actually encouraged them to apply because they have so many students. So they would kind of say oh, this is the deadline for, I think it was the Woodbridge School of Health and Sciences. This is the deadline if you want help. So I was writing recommendation letters left and right. It was insane for a middle schooler, a middle school teacher, because that's not something that you would normally think you'd be having to take care of. But I think another part of it is just really embedding this diverse curriculum across the board in terms of all subject areas, but also just all year around. I've never been a big fan of, for example, teaching African American history only during February, or LGBT history only during June, because it kind of feels very forced. It feels like, okay, I did my week of lessons for this and I checked the box and I'm done. And it's as simple as just embedding the specific students that you have culture into the classroom, but also just making sure that your texts are diverse, at least coming from an English perspective. Making sure that you're not reading the same things over and over and over, and even if you are, bringing stuff in. I taught Romeo and Juliet last year in Edison, and I can't remember the movie for the life of me right now. But instead of watching the very stereotypical 1960s version of Romeo and Juliet, I did a little bit of research and found out that there is a very famous Bollywood film that is based on Romeo and Juliet. Since I was teaching mostly Indian students, I brought that in and we watched that instead because it's essentially the same thing and they would be able to get a little bit more invested in it. And it was actually really cool because they got to teach me a lot about their culture and like what, these songs are really popular, these songs not so much. This is what this specific tradition means. And it was really, really cool because they even like went home to their parents and said like, oh, we're watching this particular movie. I'm really excited about it. And then their parents got really into it. It was just a really nice bonding experience because, that's obviously not something I grew up with. So it was really cool for them to take a minute and share their culture with me, but also have it in a way where it's academically productive. There's another activity that I've done in the past where it's basically technically two. One's called Your Name Story, where it's just a really quick story about where their name comes from. So a lot of them were telling me about how their names came from this particular story from their religion, or, this is my mom or dad went to this particular priest and they said that this was a good name for me, which is a great way to learn about culture as well. And there's another one that I do that's called Where I'm From poem, which is essentially like a Mad Lib style poem based on the same poem of that name, where I basically have them kind of input certain things based on clues on the right side. And then when you read it out, even if you're not the most creative person, you're not the best at writing poems, it still will read like a comprehensive poem. And a lot of the students got really, really into it. And, it still tells me like, what countries they're from, what their favorite foods are, all this kind of stuff. So it really just giving students a lot more opportunities to talk about their culture makes it seem not so scary for the rest of the student body. And that's also why for my now current student body, they're not as exposed to a lot of what is outside of their small bubble. So that is why I am so open with, like my identity and answering any kind of questions and stuff like that, because I've literally had students come up to me, well-intentioned, but say something along the lines of, oh, Mr. I don't usually like gay people, but you're really cool. And then we have to kind of sit there and have that conversation of, I understand what you're saying, but what you are saying is not what you are saying, kind of thing. And then they're like, oh, my bad, mister. I'm like, you're fine. It's okay. I know there's no malicious intention, but this is why we have to kind of choose our words carefully, and also why we still need that representation just in terms of everyone, because the kids want to be good people. They truly do. They want to do the right thing. They just need to be taught what that right thing is.
I appreciate you saying that. I think that, in all of this, I think we lose sight of what this is all about. This is about educating young minds, and none of us come out of the womb as racist people, and so everything that we learn is from society, and there's so much potential that young people have, and to go the opposite way, to become activists, to be able to, kind of have a nuanced understanding of our cultures. And that example of the Bollywood film is just so cool. It made me think about how lucky New Jersey is to have teachers like you who make that extra effort, because certainly a lot of this initiative, it sort of comes from the teachers who want to, right? As you were saying about pronouncing the names right and how that means so much to you, but maybe the students weren't getting that from their other teachers. There's just so much potential for teachers to kind of guide the way on this. And I wonder if you could comment on that, recognizing fully that teachers are so, strained and under a lot of pressure, and often not given the resources they need to teach effectively. So I'm definitely not saying that teachers should do one more thing, but there is a lot of power that teachers have in how they teach, to kind of introduce the opportunity to have these conversations. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many things that are outside of your control as a teacher in terms of like what your students' life at home is, what they're going through outside of the classroom, because they can't just drop that at the door. They're going to be dealing with that in the classroom, whether you want to believe it or not. whether what their cultures is, what the administration is saying, what the state is saying, what the country is saying. There's just so many factors that you cannot control, that what you can control really can make or break a lot of what a student is going through. And even it could be as simple as just like being there for students. I have so many students that will come and confide things in me and talk to me just because they don't feel comfortable talking to their parents. They don't feel comfortable talking to their counselors. They don't feel comfortable talking to anyone else. And I've had a lot of students tell me very upsetting things that they're going through at home. And it does paint the full picture, because if you're going through stuff at home, I get it. Reading Romeo and Juliet at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, it's not the first thing you want to be doing. So that's why I am a lot more lenient, sometimes to a fault, with a lot of my students, is because I know they have so much going on outside that as long as you're working with me, you're communicating with me, I will work with you to make sure that like you are living up to your full potential. Could you repeat the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
No, I think that's great. I think your response is great. I was just talking about kind of the role that teachers have, in all of this, and the power that teachers have to really kind of help reshape conversations. I would love to kind of close with just a kind of a high note, if that's possible, in this kind of challenging conversation. But part of the reason I have you all here today to talk is the goal is to kind of raise awareness, not just of the lawsuit, but kind of the underlying problem here of segregation in the schools. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how we can kind of increase awareness of this problem, or what individual people can do to create meaningful action. I just feel like sometimes something this big feels like it's completely outside of our control. So is there anything that we can be doing as individuals to either increase awareness or kind of move the needle on this? And maybe we'll start with Christina on that one.
Ooh, I think I have to think about this one. Could you come back to me?
Absolutely, yeah. Kani, do you want to go?
I think it would be great if we decided to have school segregation teach-ins. And also, Michael, I loved your lesson plans, and I think also like not only talking about the negative, but also showing the positive, like people like Michael who are trying to teach culturally sensitively, sharing both, and having kids who are in diverse environments talk about how it impacted them to be in a diverse environment educationally, both children and adults, and also having people talk about how it adversely impacted them to be in a segregated environment. I'm grateful to you, Umbrin, for offering this podcast, and we can do that in our own communities and hopefully build a group of us who care about having diverse schools, and then we can advocate for our legislators to change, because really it comes down to the state capitol to make this happen and to change the laws about districting and allow inter-district transfers, and they have to make a lot of these important decisions. So letting legislators know we care, because I'm proud, like I said, I'm proud of Senator Gopal for introducing that bill, but I don't think he heard the support from us that that's what we want, so we need to let them know that's what we want.
Yeah, it's like any solution is not going to be ideal, and then sometimes people just want status quo rather than to try and accept something that's going to come with some downsides. And I think that's what makes problems like these so hard to solve. And we haven't talked about the resource differentials among these schools, but of course that is kind of at the heart of what we're talking about, that schools that are predominantly Black and Latino have far fewer resources, and the educational disparity is so huge, as you were saying, Christina. So of course that does come down to legislative action, and that's the only way to kind of address those disparities. Michael, what are your thoughts on how people can kind of either raise awareness of this or do something about this problem?
I think it really comes down to two major factors. I think a lot of students truly don't understand the power that they have, and it makes me so happy to see people like Christina taking up this advocacy work, because a lot of students kind of they know about the problems. They're very obviously in tune with what is going on around them, but it's to a point where they genuinely just either don't think they can do anything or don't know what they can do. So having a lot of students be more vocal and talk about this advocacy and raise awareness about, hey, we see what this is going on. We see, like this school 15 minutes down the road has all these resources and we only have like half the programs. For example, my school right now, we only have 5 AP classes. I didn't teach at the high school level at Edison, especially because they have 2 different high schools there. But I know for a fact they definitely have more than 5 APs. So really just having students talk about it a lot more and creating those kind of advocacy groups and networking with each other to raise awareness, to share resources, to really just keep having this continued conversation, which would then kind of help. My second part is really showing people a reason why they should care. Because unfortunately, for a lot, if they don't see how it affects them currently right now, a lot of them won't care to make a change. Unless it's only affecting them negatively or what they perceive to be negatively, which is why we have, like we spoke about earlier, in terms of white flight, because in that moment, a lot of people are only focused on how that's affecting them in that current moment. So by kind of having those student advocacy groups, my hope would be that because their students, their kids are talking about it, that would cause a lot of parents to kind of take a double look at it and say, oh, wait a minute, this does affect my child. It is affecting their future. It is affecting their education. I want what's best for them. I also have the power to vote. I have the power to go to the people in charge, go to the Board of Ed meetings, go and be involved and continue the advocacy on behalf of their students. So really just showing them that segregation unfortunately did not end in the 60s when it was supposed to. It just has taken on a different form and is not written on paper.
Thank you. And Christina, we'll let you have the last word.
Oh no, that's a big shoe to fill in, but I think Connie and Michael put it beautifully. Like what Michael's doing is, as a student, I know that like what you're doing, Michael, is like transformative. Like because we, like, as a student, you remember those types of teachers, remember those lessons that you learn, and you like carry that throughout like the rest of your life. You're like, oh yeah, I had that one Bollywood movie, and you remember that, and but I know that your students are going to cherish that, and it's so beautiful to like listen to something like putting so much care into your classrooms. And I think it's also small actions like that that do make such a big impact. If like as students, it's, you have a voice and you do matter. And I never really spoke much when I was in elementary school. Like I didn't talk a lot. My voice always shook whenever I talked, and I was always like, felt like I was gonna cry whenever I had like a speaking like presentation. But now like I feel so more confident in myself, and I think getting involved, like speaking at the Board of Education, bringing these issues up, like to your teachers, to like your principals, assistant principals, and or even just having a conversation and educating yourselves. The power of language is like really impactful. I had a conversation the other day about how because I do a lot of research down in North Carolina about schools that do not have a lot of resources, and one word that always comes up is they're labeled low performing schools, but they're not low performing, they're just under resourced, and they have high needs. A lot of the students are from marginalized communities, and how do we talk about having those conversations, and how do we talk about these schools districts, and humanizing like a lot of I had another conversation with a few years ago about how our school district does a lot of like donations, and it's in good faith. It to be, it's seasonal, like during the season people are getting the spirits of giving back, but then it creates this weird dynamic of, here are predominantly white students that have money giving away, and like kind of almost creating like a weird dynamic where to like they're almost like white savior complex, to where white students of wealth are giving stuff to predominantly students of color. And so what kind of dynamic are you putting into students' minds already about racial dynamics? And so what other programs can we put in place for students to communicate and actually interact with different students and have that humanizing experience? And I think little things like that, or just getting involved with like writing letters. I know Connie's done a beautiful job of mobilizing like hundreds of people, and just as one person, it's like incredible what one person can do. And so building a community is so powerful.
Amazing. I think we'll leave it there tonight, but I really appreciate all of you taking the time out to have this conversation, and I hope that this is just the start of kind of the conversation that we have around this issue. You know, I mentioned to each of you that I am a print reporter. I traditionally write articles, but I really felt like this was an issue where we needed to hear directly from the people that are most affected, and that it's not easy to synthesize what is happening or what the solutions are, right? Like it's not as clear cut. And so I think just being in conversation with one another is a step forward. And I appreciate you saying, Kani, it's not just at this level, but it's in our communities, it's among our students. You know, I think you all touched on that in your points, that there's so many opportunities here for us to start just talking about the fact that these problems exist, and that, you know, we can do something about it, like if we just acknowledge it in the first place. So thank you all for your time, and you know, hopefully this is just the start of our conversation.